Darius's daily battle. The morning sun had barely begun its climb when Darius Johnson arrived at the towering skeleton of steel and concrete that was destined to be the city's newest skyscraper. His truck rumbled into the construction site parking lot, and as he shut off the engine, he took a moment to breathe in the quiet calm that came just before dawn. This was his favorite time of day, a time when the world seemed at peace, if only for a few moments. Darius was a man of quiet strength. At 45, his broad shoulders carried the weight of years spent working in construction. His hands, scarred and calloused, bore the silent testament of a life devoted to building, brick by brick, beam by beam. He took pride in his work, in the solidity of the structures he helped erect, and in the knowledge that he was making something lasting, something that would stand tall long after he was gone. But today, there was a weight heavier than the steel beams he hoisted every day. Today, he would face challenges that would push him beyond anything he had encountered before, challenges that would test his courage, his patience, and his resolve. As he stepped out of his truck and slung his tool belt over his shoulder, he could already feel the eyes of Mr. Harris, the site manager, burning into his back. Mr. Harris was a hard man, known for his stern demeanor and his intolerance for what he saw as insubordination. To him, Darius was just another worker, a cog in the machine, someone to order around. Darius knew better than to expect any recognition for his years of experience or his dedication to safety. Mr. Harris saw his workers as expendable. Johnson. Mr. Harris's sharp voice cut through the morning air, shattering the peace as easily as glass. Darius turned to face his boss, his expression calm but guarded. "Yes, sir. Get up to the 34th floor. They need extra hands on the welding team. And don't drag your feet." Darius hesitated, glancing at the safety log he held in his hand. "Sir, the forecast called for high winds today. Working that high up could be dangerous." Mr. Harris scoffed, his lips curling in a sneer. "Since when did I ask for your opinion, Johnson? Just do your job, or I'll find someone else who will." Darius clenched his jaw, swallowing back the urge to respond. This wasn't the first time he clashed with Mr. Harris. The man had a reputation for pushing his workers to their limits, prioritizing deadlines over safety. Darius had tried, time and again, to raise his concerns, to advocate for better practices, but his words had always fallen on deaf ears. As he made his way to the service elevator, he could feel the tension in his shoulders growing. Today was going to be one of those days, a day where he would have to tread carefully, where a single misstep could cost him his job. But Darius wasn't one to shy away from challenges. He had 3 children at home, each one of them depending on him. James, his oldest, had just started high school, and the expenses were piling up. Lisa, his middle child, needed braces, and little Marcus had his heart set on a school trip that Darius had promised he'd make happen. This job, this grueling, thankless work, was the foundation of the life he was building for his family. As the elevator doors closed, he pulled out a worn photo from his pocket. It was a family portrait taken 5 years ago, back when the kids were still small. He ran his thumb over the image, his heart swelling with a fierce sense of duty. No matter what challenges he faced, he would keep going. For them. The elevator chimed as it reached the 34th floor, and Darius stepped out, greeted by the howling wind that whipped through the exposed structure. His co-workers gave him nods of acknowledgement as he joined them, securing his harness and preparing to begin the day's work. "Darius," called out Jake, a younger welder who had recently joined the team. "Glad to have you up here, man. These winds are no joke." Darius gave him a reassuring smile. "Stay close, Jake. Keep your clips tight and remember, safety first." Jake nodded, visibly relieved by Darius's presence. Though Darius wasn't officially a supervisor, his years of experience and natural leadership had earned him the respect of his peers. Many of the younger workers looked up to him, relying on his guidance in the absence of effective oversight. As the morning wore on, Darius focused on his welding, every movement deliberate and precise. The work was dangerous, yes, but he trusted in his skills and his equipment. He had spent years learning the art of balance, of staying calm in the face of precarious heights and unpredictable elements. Then, just as he was securing a joint, his radio crackled to life. "Johnson," Mr. Harris' voice came through, his tone laced with impatience. "Get down here. Now." Darius frowned, glancing around. "Sir, we're in the middle of a critical task. Can it wait?" "Did I ask if it could wait?" Mr. Harris snapped. "Get down here immediately, or don't bother coming back at all." A chorus of mutters rose around him as the other workers overheard the exchange. Darius took a steadying breath, unclipping his harness and signaling to Jake to take over. "Hold the line, Jake. I'll be back soon." The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. Darius's mind raced, wondering what could possibly be so urgent. When he stepped out on the ground floor, he spotted Mr. Harris waiting, his expression a mixture of irritation and impatience. Beside him stood a man in a crisp suit, exuding an air of authority that even Mr. Harris seemed to respect. Darius recognized him immediately. Robert Crawford, CEO of Crawford Development, the primary investor behind the skyscraper project. But it wasn't just Mr. Crawford who caught Darius's attention. Standing next to him, gripping his father's hand tightly, was a young boy, no older than 7. The child wore a hard hat that seemed slightly too big for him, and his eyes sparkled with awe as he looked around the construction site. "This is my son, Tommy," Mr. Crawford said, a hint of pride in his voice. "He's fascinated by buildings, and I thought I'd show him around the site today." Mr. Harris forced a smile, though it was clear he wasn't thrilled about the disruption. "Of course, Mr. Crawford. We'll make sure he has a safe and enjoyable visit." Darius's instincts kicked in immediately. He glanced down at Tommy, sensing the boy's curiosity and energy. Kids his age had a tendency to explore, to wander, to touch things they shouldn't. A construction site, with its sharp edges, heavy machinery, and dizzying heights, was no place for a child. Mr. Crawford turned to Darius, his gaze assessing. "You're Darius Johnson, right? Harris speaks highly of your experience here." Darius forced a polite smile, though he knew better than to believe Mr. Harris had praised him. "Yes, sir. I've been with this company for nearly 20 years. "Excellent," Mr. Crawford replied, nodding approvingly. "Would you mind keeping an eye on Tommy for a bit? I have some inspections to attend to, and I feel better knowing he's with someone experienced." Darius' eyes flicked to Mr. Harris, who looked distinctly displeased, but he kept his face neutral. "Of course, sir. I'll make sure he's safe." As Mr. Crawford walked off with Mr. Harris, Darius knelt down to Tommy's level. "Hey there, buddy. I'm Darius. Do you want to see how we build these big towers?" Tommy's face lit up, his excitement almost tangible. "Yes, please. Can we go up to the top?" Darius chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Not quite to the top, but I can show you some cool things down here." He led Tommy around the ground level, pointing out various tools and explaining how they were used. Tommy listened intently, his eyes wide with fascination. Darius felt a swell of pride. It was moments like these, sharing his knowledge and seeing that spark of wonder, that reminded him why he loved his work. But as he showed Tommy the massive steel beams and explained how the building's skeleton would grow taller over time, Darius couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. He glanced over at Mr. Harris, who had resumed his conversation with Mr. Crawford a few yards away, his back turned to them. Darius knew he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. This boy was precious cargo, the son of one of the city's most powerful men. But more than that, Tommy was just a child who saw magic in the world around him, who looked up to the towering cranes and skeletal framework with the same wonder that Darius' own son, Marcus, did. As Tommy marveled at the sheer size of the beams, Darius silently promised himself that he would do whatever it took to keep the boy safe. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would stand firm, just as he had for his own family. Little did he know that this quiet promise would soon be put to the ultimate test. A fateful climb. Darius kept a close eye on Tommy as they moved around the ground level of the construction site. He noticed how the boy's gaze followed every piece of machinery, every swinging crane, every sparkling arc of the welding torches from above. There was a fierce curiosity in Tommy's eyes, a hunger to see and understand how things were put together, an eagerness that reminded Darius of himself as a young man. "Look, Tommy," Darius said, pointing up toward the 34th floor, where he'd been working before being called down. "That's where we're welding the beams together to make the building stronger. Do you see that bright light?" Tommy squinted up, nodding excitedly. "Yeah, it's like a shooting star. Is that what holds the whole building up?" "Not just that," Darius explained, smiling at the boy's amazement. "We use a lot of different parts and pieces, all working together to make sure this building can stand tall and safe. It's a big responsibility, building something like this. You have to pay close attention to everything, because even a small mistake can be dangerous." The boy nodded, soaking in Darius's words. Then his eyes shifted back to the scaffolding structure that climbed up the side of the building, his gaze lingering on the steel stairs that led higher and higher into the sky. Darius recognized the look instantly. It was the same expression Marcus wore when he saw something just a bit too exciting to resist. Before he could say anything, Mr. Harris stormed over, his face etched with irritation. He glanced between Darius and Tommy, clearly displeased that his day was being disrupted by babysitting duty. "Johnson," he barked, his tone impatient, "I need you back on the 34th floor now. We're behind schedule, and I don't have time for you to play tour guide." Darius's jaw tightened. He glanced at Tommy, who was looking up at him with wide eyes, then back at Mr. Harris. "Sir, Mr. Crawford asked me to keep an eye on his son." Mr. Harris' expression hardened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He glanced briefly at Tommy, then turned his gaze back to Darius, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Listen, Johnson, Mr. Crawford's paying me to keep this project moving, not to have you babysitting his kid. I don't care what you think you were told. Your job is to follow my orders. Now get back up there, or I'll find someone else who will." Darius bit back a retort, his eyes narrowing as he studied Mr. Harris's face. It was clear the man was looking for any excuse to get rid of him. In the years they'd worked together, Mr. Harris had always made it known that he didn't see Darius as a valuable team member, despite his years of experience. Darius didn't know if it was his background, his straightforward nature, or just that Mr. Harris couldn't tolerate anyone questioning him. But whatever it was clear that his boss was waiting for Darius to make a mistake. After a long pause, Darius nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll go back up." He turned to Tommy, giving him a gentle smile. "Listen, Tommy, I need you to stay right here, okay? Don't go anywhere, and if you need anything, ask Mr. Harris." Tommy nodded, but Darius could see the disappointment in his eyes. The boy had been looking forward to exploring more, to seeing the parts of the building that was still under construction. But Darius had no choice. He couldn't risk his job. His family depended on him. He gave Tommy one last reassuring look before heading toward the service elevator, his heart heavy with unease. As the elevator doors closed, he could still see Tommy standing by Mr. Harris, his small frame dwarfed by the towering steel beams around him. The ride up felt slower than usual. Darius's mind was filled with a storm of thoughts, worries about leaving Tommy with Mr. Harris, the dangerous conditions at this height, the winds that had been picking up since morning. He'd voiced his concerns, but as usual, Mr. Harris had dismissed them. To him, safety was a secondary concern, something that could be sacrificed if it meant meeting the project's deadlines. As the elevator climbed, Darius took a deep breath, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling in his gut. This job was all he had to provide for his family, and he couldn't afford to lose it. He would finish his shift, keep his head down, and go home. That was all he could do. When the elevator doors finally slid open on the 34th floor, he was greeted by the familiar gust of wind and the sight of his co-workers huddled around the exposed beams, welding and securing the structure. Jake, his younger colleague, looked up and gave him a nod as he stepped out. "Good to have you back, Darius," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "It's getting rough up here. Thought you might have gotten the easy job babysitting." Darius managed a small smile, though his mind was still on Tommy. Not quite, but let's get this done. As he rejoined the team, the wind picked up again, rattling the temporary guardrails and sending an unsettling shiver through the structure. Darius worked methodically, securing his harness and double-checking his clips, his movements practiced and efficient, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then he heard it, a faint cry, carried up by the wind. "Help!" Darius froze, his blood turning cold. He knew that voice. It was Tommy. Without hesitation, he turned and scanned the ground below, his heart hammering in his chest. It took a moment, but then he spotted him, Tommy, halfway up the scaffolding on the south side of the building, his small hands clutching the rail as he climbed higher and higher, oblivious to the danger. A surge of fear shot through Darius as he watched the boy's tiny figure ascending the narrow stairs, each step taking him further from safety. The scaffolding wasn't meant for someone his size. It was designed for experienced workers, secured with safety harnesses and gear. One wrong move, one gust of wind, and Tommy could fall. Darius didn't think, he simply acted. Abandoning his tools, he sprinted toward the service elevator, his hands shaking as he hit the button to descend. Every second felt like an eternity as he watched the numbers tick down, his heart pounding in his ears. As the elevator doors finally opened on the ground floor, he bolted out, his eyes locked on the scaffolding where Tommy was now nearing the higher levels. Darius could see the boy's legs wobbling as he tried to steady himself against the wind, his small hands gripping the rails with white-knuckled fear. "Tommy," Darius shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "Hold on, don't move." Tommy glanced down, his face pale with fear as he realized how high he climbed. His small frame shivered in the gusts, his Batman t-shirt billowing in the wind. Behind him, he heard Mr. Harris' voice calling out, but Darius ignored it. He didn't have time to argue or explain. All that mattered was reaching Tommy before something terrible happened. Darius sprinted to the base of the scaffolding, his pulse racing. He could see the danger now. One of the bolts securing the stairs was loose, the structure swaying slightly with each gust. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and Tommy was right in the middle of it. Without hesitating, Darius began to climb, his hands gripping the cold steel as he pulled himself up, step by step. The wind whipped at his face, the metal vibrating beneath his hands, but he forced himself to focus. Tommy was only a few levels above him, clinging to the rail as he looked down with wide, terrified eyes. "Tommy, listen to me." Darius called up, his voice steady despite his fear. "I need you to stay very still. Don't move, okay? I'm coming to get you." Tommy nodded, his face a mixture of fear and trust. Darius climbed faster, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. But this was different. This wasn't just another job. This was a child's life on the line, a life that had been entrusted to him, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. When he reached Tommy's level, he could see the boy's small hands trembling, his grip slipping as the wind howled around them. Carefully, Darius reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "It's okay, Tommy," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I've got you. Just hold on tight, and we'll go down together." Tommy nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but his grip steadying slightly. Darius positioned himself behind the boy, securing his own harness and attaching a spare clip to Tommy's belt. He knew the scaffolding was unstable, but he didn't have a choice. They had to move slowly, carefully, one step at a time. As they descended, the wind picked up again, and Darius could feel the structure shudder beneath them. Each step was a test of his strength and balance, his muscles straining as he shielded Tommy from the gusts. He kept his eyes focused on the path ahead, blocking out the dizzying height and the dangers surrounding them. But then, just as they reached the lower levels, there was a loud creak, a sound that sent chills down Darius's spine. One of the beams had shifted, dislodging a metal tool that clattered down the stairs, narrowly missing them. Darius tightened his grip on Tommy, his heart pounding as he quickened their pace. They were almost there, almost safe. Just a few more steps, and they would be back on solid ground. When they finally reached the bottom, Darius lifted Tommy into his arms, holding him close as he took a deep, shuddering breath. The relief was overwhelming, and for a moment he closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the weight of what they had just escaped. But his relief was short-lived. As he opened his eyes, he saw Mr. Harris striding toward them, his face twisted in anger. "Johnson," he barked, his voice cold and furious. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Darius looked up, his expression defiant as he held Tommy protectively. "I was doing your job, Mr. Harris, keeping him safe." The price of integrity. The weight of Tommy's small body was comforting in Darius's arms as he stood facing Mr. Harris, his boss's glare as sharp as a knife. Darius held Tommy protectively, the boy still clinging to him with shaky hands, his small face pressed against Darius's shoulder. There was a silence around them as other workers stopped what they were doing, glancing nervously between the two men. Mr. Harris's face twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief as he looked at Darius. It was as if he couldn't believe that a mere worker had dared to step outside the lines of his orders, even if it meant saving a child's life. "Johnson," Mr. Harris spat, his voice cold and filled with barely controlled fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've disrupted the entire site. I gave you a direct order, and you completely ignored it. Do you think you're some kind of hero?" Darius felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. He had always respected authority and had tried his best to avoid conflicts, especially with Mr. Harris, but today was different. Today, his actions had been about more than just following orders. They had been about doing what was right. "Mr. Harris," Darius replied evenly, his voice steady, "I did what I had to do to keep this boy safe." Tommy was left unattended, and he started climbing the scaffolding on his own. He could have fallen. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Mr. Harris' eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It wasn't your responsibility, Johnson. You're here to work, not to play hero. And if you followed orders and stayed where I put you, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Darius clenched his jaw, his frustration barely contained. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't about following orders. It's about ensuring safety on this site. Leaving a child unsupervised in a dangerous area, how could that possibly be acceptable?" For a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Mr. Harris's face, but he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "Don't you lecture me on safety, Johnson. You're not in charge here, and I don't need your advice on how to run this site. I know what I'm doing." Darius felt Tommy shift slightly in his arms, and he glanced down at the boy. Tommy's wide eyes looked up at him, filled with gratitude and trust. Darius felt his resolve strengthen. He wasn't going to back down, not this time. "I'm not questioning your authority, Mr. Harris," Darius said, his tone calm but firm. "But if my actions today saved this boy's life, then I'd do it again, no matter the consequences." Mr. Harris' expression darkened, and his mouth twisted into a bitter sneer. "Oh, there will be consequences, Johnson. Make no mistake about that. I've had enough of your insubordination. You're a troublemaker, always questioning orders, always thinking you know better." He turned to the gathering crowd of workers who had been watching the exchange with bated breath. "Listen up, everyone." Mr. Harris' voice boomed across the site. "What Johnson did today was reckless and unacceptable. If anyone else thinks they can go against my orders, think again. I don't tolerate defiance on my site." The workers exchanged uneasy glances, some of them shifting uncomfortably. Darius could see sympathy in their eyes, a shared understanding of what he was going through. They knew the risks, the dangers of the job, and they respected him for his dedication to safety. But speaking up against Mr. Harris was a different story. It was something most of them couldn't afford to do. Just then, Robert Crawford, the project's primary investor and Tommy's father, approached from the far side of the site. He had heard the commotion and had left his inspection to see what was happening. His face was a mixture of concern and confusion as he looked between Mr. Harris, Darius, and his son in Darius's arms. "Tommy," Crawford called, his voice filled with relief. He stepped forward, reaching for his son. Tommy wriggled out of Darius's arms and ran to his father, wrapping his small arms around him. "Daddy, I got to see the whole building from up there." Tommy's voice was excited, oblivious to the tension in the air. "But then I got scared, and Mr. Darius came and saved me." Crawford's gaze shifted from Tommy to Darius, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice soft but intense. Darius nodded, his expression respectful but unyielding. "Yes, sir." Tommy had climbed up the scaffolding and was in real danger of falling. "I went up to bring him down safely." Crawford's face softened, and he gave Darius a slight nod of respect. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I can't imagine what might have happened if you hadn't acted so quickly." Mr. Harris bristled, his face reddening as he interjected. "With all due respect, Mr. Crawford, this entire situation could have been avoided if Johnson had followed orders and stayed where he was assigned. His actions were reckless and put the entire site at risk. He shouldn't have interfered." Crawford's eyes turned cold as he looked at Mr. Harris. "Are you telling me that my son's life wasn't worth the risk?" Mr. Harris swallowed, clearly thrown off by the question. "Of course not, sir, but there are protocols to follow. If we let every worker make decisions on their own, this site would be chaos. We need discipline, order." Crawford looked back at Darius, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Tell me, Mr. Johnson, do you often find yourself questioning the safety protocols on this site?" Darius hesitated, sensing that his answer could have serious consequences, but he decided to be honest. "Yes, sir. I've raised concerns about the conditions here several times. Safety seems to be a secondary priority on this site, and it's been getting worse." Crawford's gaze hardened, and he turned to Mr. Harris, his tone now icy. "I trust you understand that my primary concern is the safety of every person on this site, especially my own son. I expect you to take these concerns seriously." Mr. Harris's face flushed, but he forced a tight smile. "Of course, Mr. Crawford. I assure you, safety is a top priority here." Darius could see the insincerity in Mr. Harris' expression. He knew that this was just an act, a temporary appeasement for the sake of the investor. Once Crawford was gone, things would go back to the way they were, and Darius would likely face retaliation for speaking out. Darius nodded, grateful but wary. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing what I felt was right." As Crawford walked away, leading Tommy back to the car, Darius knew that his actions today had set something in motion. But as soon as Crawford was out of sight, Mr. Harris turned back to him, his face twisting into a look of barely contained rage. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you?" Mr. Harris hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You think just because you impress the big boss, you can defy me and get away with it." Darius held his ground, meeting Mr. Harris's gaze unflinchingly. "I don't think I'm untouchable, sir. I just think it's my duty to keep this site safe. That's all." Mr. Harris' lips curled into a sneer. "Well, you've just made the biggest mistake of your life, Johnson. I'm done with you. Consider this your last day on the job." The words hit Darius like a punch to the gut. He had suspected that this might happen, but hearing it confirmed left him momentarily stunned. He thought of his family, the bills that were piling up, the dreams he had for his children's future. Losing this job would devastate them. "But Mr. Harris," Darius began, but Harris cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I don't want to hear it. Pack up your things and get off my site, and don't expect a reference either. You're done here, Johnson. Darius felt the eyes of his co-workers on him, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and helplessness. He could tell that they wanted to speak up, to defend him, but they were afraid of losing their jobs, of crossing Mr. Harris. It was a silent betrayal, one that stung, even though he understood their reasons. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wouldn't let Mr. Harris see the hurt or the fear that was coursing through him. Instead, he nodded, his voice steady and dignified. "If that's what you want, sir." Turning away, he walked toward the locker room, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the decision he'd made. He had done the right thing, he knew that, but now he would pay the price. As he packed up his belongings, he thought about his family. He would have to go home and tell them that he'd lost his job, that they would have to make sacrifices until he found something new. The thought filled him with a mixture of dread and guilt, but he pushed it aside. He had acted with integrity, with courage, and he couldn't regret that, no matter the cost. As he walked out of the site for the last time, he glanced up at the towering building, its skeletal frame rising against the sky. It was a symbol of both his pride and his downfall, a reminder of the life he had built and the sacrifices he was willing to make. The journey ahead would be hard, but he would face it with the same strength that had carried him through so many trials before. For Darius, this was not the end. It was just another challenge, another battle in the story of his life. And as he walked away, head held high, he knew that he had won something far more valuable than a job. He had won his self-respect, his integrity, and the trust of a young boy whose life he had saved. I don't know what to say, Mr. Crawford," Darius stammered, feeling overwhelmed. It's more than I ever expected." Crawford smiled, his expression kind. "I understand that it's a big change, but I believe you're the right person for the job. You'll have the authority to make decisions, to ensure that safety and integrity are at the forefront of everything we do. And of course, you'll be compensated fairly for your work." Darius felt a surge of emotion rise within him, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and excitement. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, a chance to build something meaningful and to provide for his family with dignity. He looked at Crawford, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Crawford extended his hand again, and Darius shook it firmly, sealing the agreement. As he left the office, he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had lost one job, but in doing so, he had gained something far greater, a new purpose, a new path, and the chance to make a real difference. When he returned home that evening, Monica was waiting for him, her eyes filled with hope and anticipation. Darius pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as he shared the news. "He offered me a job," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "A real job. Building affordable housing. Something that actually matters." Monica's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him back. "I knew something good would come out of this, Darius. You deserve this. We deserve this." They stood together in their small kitchen, holding each other in a moment of quiet celebration. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be new challenges, new sacrifices. But for the first time in a long time, Darius felt truly hopeful about the future. As the days passed, Darius threw himself into his new role with a passion he hadn't felt in years. He worked closely with Crawford, overseeing the project with a meticulous eye for detail and a commitment to safety that he had honed over his years on the construction site. He hired a team of workers who shared his values, people who understood the importance of building not just structures, but communities. The affordable housing project became a beacon of hope for the city, a place where families could find safe, stable homes without breaking the bank. Darius knew that every brick he laid, every beam he secured, was a step toward a better future for people like him, people who had been overlooked and undervalued for too long. And as he watched the buildings rise, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he was finally building something that mattered. He was no longer just a worker. He was a leader, a creator, a man who had found his purpose. A new foundation. Darius Johnson's days had taken on a different rhythm. Instead of grueling hours under the unrelenting supervision of Mr. Harris, he now spent his time overseeing a project that filled him with pride and purpose. Crawford Development's affordable housing project was progressing steadily, and every day, Darius could see the buildings taking shape, row by row, each one a promise of shelter and stability for families in need. The project was not without its challenges. Affordable housing required careful budgeting and creative problem-solving to keep costs down without compromising on quality. Darius had to juggle material shortages, budget constraints, and the demands of a tight schedule. Yet, he felt invigorated, driven by the knowledge that his work was finally making a difference. But one particular morning, as he arrived on site, Darius noticed a group of local residents gathered outside the construction fence. It wasn't uncommon for people to stop by and watch the progress, but this crowd looked different. They weren't just curious, they were anxious, talking in low voices, casting nervous glances at the construction site. Darius approached them, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the scene. Among the group, he recognized a familiar face, Rosa Martinez, a single mother of 3 who lived in a nearby apartment building slated for demolition. She looked up as Darius approached, relief flashing in her eyes. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice strained with worry. "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." Darius nodded, motioning for her to continue. "Of course, Rosa, what's going on?" She glanced around at the others before speaking, her voice filled with frustration and fear. "They're saying our building's going to be torn down before the new apartments are ready. I've got 3 kids, and I can't afford to move anywhere else. A lot of us can't. They told us this project was for us, but now we're being forced out of our homes before we even have a place to go." Darius felt a pang of anger and sadness as he listened to her story. He had assumed the project was progressing smoothly and hadn't realized that these families were already facing eviction. Affordable housing projects often promised a brighter future, but too often they came with hidden costs for the communities they were meant to serve. "I'm sorry, Rosa," he said, his voice low and filled with empathy. "I didn't know this was happening. I'll talk to Mr. Crawford and see if we can delay the demolition until we have places ready for everyone here. That's a promise." Rosa's shoulders sagged in relief, but there was still doubt in her eyes. "I hope you're right, Mr. Johnson. I don't know where we'll go if they tear down our building now. My kids, they deserve a safe place to live." Darius placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I understand, and I won't let you or your kids end up on the streets. I'll make sure of it." As he walked back onto the construction site, Darius's mind was racing. He knew this wouldn't be an easy fix. There were powerful interests at play, people who didn't care about the lives of families like Rosa's. To them, this project was just another investment, another set of numbers on a ledger. But to Darius, it was so much more. It was about people, families, and the promise of a better life. That afternoon, Darius arranged a meeting with Robert Crawford. As he entered Crawford's office, he felt a mixture of determination and anxiety. He respected Crawford, the man who had given him this chance, but he knew that advocating for the residents could put him at odds with the powerful businessman. Crawford looked up from his desk, his expression welcoming but curious. "Darius, good to see you. Is everything okay with the project?" Darius took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Yes, sir, the construction is going well, but there's something else I need to discuss with you. It's about the residents who are supposed to move into these new units. I just found out that some of them are facing eviction from their current homes before our project is ready. Families with children. They're terrified, Mr. Crawford." Crawford's face grew serious, and he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled as he considered Darius's words. "I wasn't aware of that, but I understand the concerns. The pressure from our investors and the city council to clear that land for new developments is significant." Darius's frustration flared, but he kept his voice calm. "Sir, I understand the pressures, but if we're building this project to help these families, then we need to do it right. We can't uproot them without a place to go. This project was supposed to be about giving them stability, not putting them through more turmoil. Crawford studied Darius for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're a good man, Darius. I knew that when I hired you. But you have to understand that delaying demolition could impact the entire timeline. Investors don't like setbacks, and neither do city officials." Darius met his gaze, his voice steady and resolute. "I know that, sir. But I also know that we're talking about people's lives here. These families are depending on us. They're trusting us to keep our word. Isn't there any way we can make this work?" Crawford fell silent, lost in thought. Finally, he nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "I'll see what I can do. I'll talk to the investors and the city council, see if we can delay the demolition. But there's no guarantee, Darius. You'll have to prepare for the possibility that we may not be able to help everyone." Darius felt a surge of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, sir. That's all I ask. I just want us to try." As he left Crawford's office, Darius felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, and he would have to fight to protect these families. But he was ready to take on the challenge. This was more than just a job to him. It was a mission, a chance to make a real difference. Over the next few weeks, Darius worked tirelessly to balance his responsibilities on the construction site with his efforts to advocate for the residents. He met with community leaders, attended city council meetings, and even organized a gathering of residents to voice their concerns to local officials. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon people began to see him as more than just a construction manager. He was their ally, their champion, someone who truly cared about their welfare. The struggle wasn't easy. Darius faced pushback from all sides: investors frustrated by delays, city officials who saw him as a nuisance, and even some of his own colleagues who questioned his decision to take on such a controversial cause. But he refused to back down, driven by the memories of the families he had spoken to, the children who needed a safe place to grow up. One evening, after a particularly intense city council meeting, Darius returned home exhausted but satisfied. Monica was waiting for him, her face lit with pride as she listened to him recount the day's events. "You're doing something incredible, Darius," she said, her eyes shining. "These people need someone to fight for them, and you're giving them hope." Darius smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I'm just trying to do what's right. I never thought I'd be here, you know. I thought I'd spend my whole life working for people like Mr. Harris, barely getting by. But now, I feel like I'm finally building something that matters." As they held each other, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was what he had always wanted, not just a job, but a legacy, something his children could be proud of. But as the project neared completion, Darius faced a new obstacle, one he hadn't anticipated. Word had spread through the developer community about his activism, and several prominent investors began to pressure Crawford to replace him, citing his disruptive influence and activist tendencies. To them, Darius's advocacy was a liability, a threat to their profits. Crawford called him into his office once more, his expression troubled as he relayed the news. "Darius, you've done incredible work here, but I'm receiving a lot of pressure to make changes. Investors are worried about your influence on future projects. They want someone who will focus on the bottom line." Darius felt a pang of betrayal, but he kept his voice calm. "I understand, Mr. Crawford. If you need to replace me, I won't hold it against you. I'm grateful for everything you've given me, but I want you to know that I stand by what I've done. These families deserve someone who cares about them." Crawford sighed, looking conflicted. "I don't want to lose you, Darius. You've been invaluable to this project. But I have to keep my investors happy. It's a delicate balance." Darius nodded, accepting the reality of the situation. He knew that his time on the project might be coming to an end, but he also knew that he had made an impact, one that couldn't be erased, no matter what happened next. As he left Crawford's office, he made a silent promise to himself. Even if he lost his job, even if the investors forced him out, he wouldn't stop fighting for the community. He would find other ways to support them, to ensure that their voices were heard. In the days that followed, Darius continued to work on the project with the same dedication and passion, knowing that his efforts had already made a difference. The residents began to see hope on the horizon, knowing that their advocate was there for them, someone who wouldn't abandon them when things got tough. And as he watched the buildings rise, as he saw the walls go up and the roofs take shape, he knew that he had built more than just homes. He had built trust, respect, and a sense of belonging for people who had long been forgotten. His work had become a foundation, not just of concrete and steel, but of hope and resilience. In his heart, Darius knew that he had found his calling. He had become more than a construction worker. He was a community builder, a protector, a voice for the voiceless. No matter what came next, he would carry that legacy forward, and he would continue to fight for what was right. Legacy of fighter. The following weeks passed in a blur of hard work, intense meetings, and endless paperwork. Darius felt like he was constantly being pulled in different directions. On one hand, he had the residents counting on him, families who were waiting for their new homes with the hope of a better life. On the other hand, he was under constant scrutiny from investors and city officials who were increasingly impatient with the project delays and rising costs. Darius poured himself into the work, knowing that this might be his last opportunity to make a difference for the people he had come to care about so deeply. As the affordable housing project neared completion, he pushed his team to go above and beyond, insisting on the highest standards of safety and quality, ensuring that every detail was perfect. This wasn't just another job to him, it was his legacy. One evening, as he was reviewing the final blueprints in his temporary office on site, he received a call from Rosa Martinez, the single mother he had met earlier in the project. Her voice was filled with emotion as she spoke. "Mr. Johnson, I just wanted to say thank you," Rosa said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I heard from the relocation office today. My kids and we're going to move into one of the new apartments next month. You kept your promise." Darius felt his heart swell with pride and relief. He had fought hard to keep the city and investors from pushing residents out prematurely, and hearing that his efforts had paid off was deeply rewarding. "You're welcome, Rosa. You and your family deserve a safe, stable home. I'm just glad I could help make that happen." He could hear Rosa's children chattering excitedly in the background, and he imagined them running through the empty rooms of their soon-to-be home, dreaming of their new life. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had fought so hard. But he also knew that this project was just one small step in a much larger struggle. There were countless other families like Rosa's who needed advocates, people who would fight for their right to safe and affordable housing. As he hung up the phone, he glanced around his office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He knew that his time on this project was coming to an end. The investors had made it clear that they weren't comfortable with his activist approach, and Crawford, despite his respect for Darius, had admitted that he was under too much pressure to keep him on for future projects. But Darius wasn't afraid. This experience had given him the confidence and clarity he had been searching for all his life. He had discovered a passion for community work, a calling that went beyond construction. He wanted to continue helping people, advocating for those who didn't have a voice. Losing this job didn't feel like a setback, it felt like the beginning of something new. 2 weeks later, the project was officially complete, and the first families began moving into their new apartments. The opening ceremony was a small but heartfelt event, with families, community members, and a few local officials in attendance. Darius watched as families crossed the threshold into their new homes, their faces alight with joy and relief. The sight was bittersweet, knowing he wouldn't be around to see the long-term impact of his work, but he felt immense pride in what he had accomplished. Robert Crawford approached him after the ceremony, extending a hand. "Darius, I don't think I can ever fully express my gratitude for what you've done here. You've gone above and beyond, and you've made this project into something more meaningful than any of us could have imagined." Darius shook his hand, giving Crawford a sincere smile. "Thank you, sir. It's been an honor to work on something that actually makes a difference. I'll always be grateful for this opportunity." Crawford hesitated, a trace of regret in his eyes. "I wish things could be different, Darius. The investors, well, you know how they are. They're focused on profits, and they don't see the bigger picture the way you do. But if there's anything I can do to support you in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out." Darius nodded, understanding the constraints Crawford was under. "I appreciate that, Mr. Crawford. I've learned a lot here, and I'm ready to take that knowledge forward." As the ceremony wrapped up, Darius took one last look at the buildings he had helped create. They stood tall and proud, a testament to the power of resilience, community, and the belief that everyone deserves a chance at a better life. With a sense of closure, he walked away from the project's site for the final time, his heart full of hope and determination. In the weeks that followed, Darius began networking with local community leaders and advocacy groups. He shared his story and offered his skills as a construction manager, emphasizing his commitment to affordable housing and community-driven projects. His story had garnered some attention in the media, and before long, he found himself at the center of a new movement, a coalition of activists, non-profit organizations, and community leaders who were committed to fighting for affordable housing across the city. Through his work with the coalition, Darius discovered that his skills could be applied in powerful ways outside the traditional construction industry. He became an advocate, a mentor, and a community organizer, helping to educate residents about their rights and encouraging them to stand up against unjust evictions and housing discrimination. His journey took him into city council chambers, where he spoke passionately about the need for responsible development and affordable housing policies. He lobbied for stronger tenant protections, met with city planners, and even testified before the state legislature, sharing his first-hand experiences and the stories of the families he had helped. The coalition began gaining traction, and soon, Darius became one of its most prominent voices. His background as a construction worker and his experience on the Crawford Development Project gave him a unique perspective that resonated with people. He wasn't just another politician or corporate figure, he was one of them, someone who had lived through the struggles they faced every day. As the months turned into years, Darius' influence continued to grow. His coalition successfully advocated for new affordable housing projects, stronger tenant protections, and community-driven development policies. He even established a non-profit organization, Foundations of Hope, dedicated to supporting low-income families in securing stable housing. The organization offered workshops, financial assistance, and advocacy services, helping families to stay in their homes and navigate the often overwhelming bureaucracy of the housing system. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning sessions, Darius returned home to find his family waiting for him with a surprise. Monica and the kids had prepared a celebratory dinner, complete with homemade banners and balloons. As he walked into the dining room, they greeted him with cheers and applause. "What's all this?" Darius asked, laughing as he hugged each of his children. Monica beamed at him, her eyes filled with pride. "We just wanted to celebrate you, Darius. You've come so far, and you've done so much for this community. We're so proud of you." Darius felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked around at his family. They had stood by him through every challenge, every setback, and every success. They were his foundation, the reason he had kept going even when things seemed impossible. As they sat down to eat, James, his oldest son, spoke up. "Dad, you're a hero, you know that. You're helping so many people. I want to be like you when I grow up." Darius felt his heart swell with pride. "Thank you, James. But remember, being a hero isn't about what other people think. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. And it's about taking care of the people you love, just like you all have taken care of me." They ate and laughed, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Darius knew that his journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, families to help, and policies to change. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his family, his community, and the support of people who believed in his vision for a better world. In the years that followed, Darius's work continued to make an impact. He became a respected leader in the community, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. His nonprofit grew, expanding its reach to cities across the state and providing resources to thousands of families. The affordable housing policies he had helped champion led to the construction of new developments that prioritized the needs of low-income residents over profit margins. And as he watched these new buildings rise, he felt the same pride he had felt when he'd worked on that first affordable housing project. He knew that he was building more than just walls and roofs. He was building hope, security, and opportunity for families who had been forgotten by society. One evening, as Darius walked through one of the newly completed neighborhoods, he saw children playing in the streets, families chatting on their porches, and gardens blooming in small front yards. The sight filled him with a sense of fulfillment he had never imagined. He realized that he had created something lasting, something that would benefit generations to come. In his heart, Darius knew that he had found his true calling. He was more than just a builder, he was a protector, a champion, a guardian of his community. And as he stood there, watching the sun set over the neighborhood he had helped bring to life, he felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had been long and difficult, filled with obstacles and sacrifices, but he had stayed true to his values, to his family, and to his community. And in the end, he had built something far greater than he could have ever imagined, a legacy of hope, resilience, and compassion. Darius Johnson, once a simple construction worker, had become a symbol of strength and integrity, a man whose life had been transformed by his courage to stand up for what was right. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that his work was only just beginning. The foundation he had laid would continue to grow, empowering others to rise up, to fight for justice, and to build a world where everyone had a place to call home.